Guiding questions. These are questions that you'll be thinking about throughout the entire module. What makes a poem a poem? What inspires writers to write poetry? Learning targets for Lesson 4. I can analyze how Jack's attitude towards poetry is changing using evidence from the text. I can identify characteristics of poetry when analyzing the poem Dog. I can explain what Jack understands about poetry. We are continuing to read the novel Love That Dog by Sharon Creech. While you read, think about the following questions. What makes a poem a poem? What inspires writers to write poetry? While you read, take notice of what Jack is learning about poetry as he writes his own. Follow along with your book if you have it. Page 12, November 9th. I don't have any pets, so I can't write about one. And especially, I can't write a poem about one. Page 13, November 15th. Yes, I used to have a pet. I don't want to write about it. You're going to ask me, why not, right? Page 14, November 22nd. Pretend I still have that pet? Can't I make up a pet? A different one? Like a tiger or a hamster, a goldfish, turtle, snail, worm, flea? Page 15, November 29th. I like those small poems we read today. When they're small like that, you can read a whole bunch in a short time, and then in your head are all the pictures of all the small things from all the small poems. I liked how the kitten leaped in the cat poem, and how you could see the long head of the horse in the horse poem. Page 16. And especially I like the dog in the dog poem, because that's just how my yellow dog used to lie down, with his tongue all limp and his chin between his paws, and how he'd sometimes chomp at a fly and then sleep in his loose skin, just like that poet Miss Valerie Worth says in her small dog poem. Page 17, December 4th. Why do you want to type up what I wrote about reading the small poems? It's not a poem, is it? I guess you can put it on the board if you want to, but don't put my name on it in case other people think it's not a poem. Page 18, December 13th. I guess it does look like a poem when you see it typed up like that, but I think maybe it would look better if there was more space between the lines, like how I wrote it the first time. And I like the picture of the yellow dog you put beside it. Page 19. But that's not how my yellow dog looked. Now that we've read those selected pages from the novel Love That Dog, we're going to look at pages 3 and 4 in our purple workbook, and we're going to write gist statements about each section of the novel. Let's take a look at the first column, dated November 9th through November 22nd, found on pages 12 through 14. In this section, we read about Jack, who doesn't want to write a poem about a pet. And what I want you to do, that's the gist statement, what I want you to do is go back to pages 12 and through 14 in your book, and I want you to actually pick out 2 or 3 details that help us prove that gist statement is the right one. So you're going to be looking for things Jack says about not wanting to write a poem about a pet. Do that now. Let's take a look at the next row, dated November 29th, found on pages 15 through 16. And in this entry, Jack is talking about the small poems that he read, and we can tell that Jack is starting to like these poems. He actually says some things in there that help us come up with this gist statement that Jack liked the new poems he read. So what I want you to do is go back to the text on pages 15 through 16, and I want you to find at least 2 details. Write down 2 exact quotes from the book that tell us that Jack likes the new poems he read. So you're going to find at least 2 lines in the text. Okay, let's take a look at the last section that we're going to write a gist statement for. That's December 4th through December 13th, found on pages 17 through 19. In this section, we find out that Jack is actually letting his teacher put what he wrote about reading small poems on the board. You might notice that this is a big step for Jack, and so what I want you to do is go back to the text on pages 17 through 19, and I want you to write down at least 2 details that you can find. For this next activity, we're going to look at some direct quotes from the novel Love That Dog, and they're going to help us figure out some information about Jack. I don't want to because boys don't write poetry. Page 1. I tried. Can't do it. Brain's empty. Page 2. Do you promise not to put it on the board? Page 4. I did not really understand the Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright poem, but at least it sounded good to my ears. Page 8. I liked the small poems we read today. Page 15. I guess you can put it on the board if you want to, but don't put my name on it. Page 17. Think to yourself, what do these quotes from the text tell us about Jack's attitude towards poetry? I don't want to because boys don't write poetry. Page 1. I tried. Can't do it. Brain's empty. Page 2. Do you promise not to put it on the board? Page 4. I did not really understand the Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright poem, but at least it sounded good to my ears. Page 8. I liked the small poems we read today. Page 15. I guess you can put it on the board if you want to, but don't put my name on it. Page 17. Now that we've circled some key words, I want you to think, how could we sort these quotes? In other words, what categories could we put these quotes in to help us make sense of them? As I'm looking at the list of quotes, I realize that they're already grouped together in a certain way, and these 2 groups within that group, they all have something in common. So let's take a look at the first group on the left. I see the words I don't want to, can't do it, brain's empty, not to put it on the board. Then when we look to the right, I notice that the words that are circled, things like, but at least it sounded good to my ears, I liked, I guess you can put it on the board. Ask yourself, is there a difference in the tone of his words? So on the left-hand side, there's a different tone than there is on the right-hand side. The words on the left-hand side have a more negative connotation. The words on the right sound much more positive. Sorting the words into negative and positive is one way that we could categorize these quotes. Now I want us to think of another way that we could categorize these quotes. Still keeping them in the same group, but thinking of a different title or a different way to label these groups. Notice that these quotes are in order that they happen in the novel. We call that sequential order or chronological order. I can tell because the page numbers are in order, page 1, page 2, page 4, page 8, page 15, and page 17. So I want us to think now, ask yourself, when did he say these things? And maybe that will help us come up with another label for these groups. To answer this question, I'm going to look back in the book at pages 1, 2, and 4 to see when he said these things. Then I'm going to look back in the book on pages 8, 15, and 17 to find out when Jack said these things. When I looked back in the book, the words on the left-hand side were said in September and October, while the words on the right-hand side were said in November and December. I've added the labels of September, October, and November, December above the quotes. And as I think more about it, I realize that September and October is the beginning of Jack's school year. It's when he first would have been introduced to poetry. And by November and December, which is the middle of Jack's school year, I notice that his words are becoming more positive about poetry. So I'm going to add the labels beginning of Jack's school year and middle of Jack's school year to the categories above. Now we can ask ourselves that big question: how is Jack's attitude toward poetry changing? Look from the beginning of Jack's school year to now, when we're in the middle of Jack's school year. How is his attitude towards poetry changing? If you answered that Jack's attitude towards poetry is changing from being negative at the beginning of the story to being more positive now, you'd be correct. He actually seems to like poetry, both reading and writing it. Now we're going to read the poem Dog by Valerie Worth that Jack read in Miss Stretchberry's class. While you read, think about the following questions. What makes a poem a poem? What inspires writers to write poetry? While you read, take notice of how the poem is written and how it is read. Follow along with your book if you have it. Dog by Valerie Worth. Under a maple tree the dog lies down, lolls his limp tongue, yawns, rests his long chin carefully between front paws, looks up alert, chops with heavy jaws at a slow fly, blinks, rolls on his side, sighs, closes his eyes, sleeps all afternoon in his loose skin. Dog by Valerie Worth. Under a maple tree the dog lies down, lolls his limp tongue, yawns, rests his long chin carefully between front paws, looks up alert, chops with heavy jaws at a slow fly, blinks, rolls on his side, sighs, closes his eyes, sleeps all afternoon in his loose skin. Now that we've had the opportunity to read the poem Dog by Valerie Worth, just like Jack did, we're going to go back to the novel and reread the section where Jack talks about this poem. November 29th. I liked those small poems we read today. When they're small like that, you can read a whole bunch in a short time, and then in your head are all the pictures of all the small things from all the small poems. I liked how the kitten leapt in the cat poem, and how you could see the long head of the horse in the horse poem. And especially I liked the dog in the dog poem, because that's just how my yellow dog used to lie down, with his tongue all limp and his chin between his paws, and how he'd sometimes chomp at a fly and then sleep in his loose skin, just like that poet Miss Valerie Worth says in her small dog poem. Open up your purple workbook to page 8, and here we will find a spot to record Jack's reflections on Dog by Valerie Worth. Let's think about what Jack says about poetry. On page 15, in the entry dated November 29th, Jack talks about the small poems. He says, I liked those small poems we read today. When they're small like that, you can read a whole bunch in a short time. We're going to record this information in the graphic organizer on page 8 in your purple workbook. Pause the video to make sure you have enough time to fill in your purple workbook. Now we're going to take a look at what Jack writes and what we can infer about his writing. So when I look back at what he's written on pages 15 and 16, I see that he uses a lot of words to describe his dog and how the poem made him think about his own yellow dog that he used to have. And so I'm going to highlight some of those things, and we're going to fill in the graphic organizer for what Jack writes. Based on what Jack wrote, what can we infer about what Jack is learning about poetry? So he's using words like yellow dog, tongue all limp, sometimes he'd chomp at a fly. Those are words that really help the reader visualize. They're very vivid words, so think about that when you're making your inference, and I'll give you a sentence starter. Jack is using blank to paint a picture of what his dog blank. So think about what characteristic of poetry is Jack using, and what does that characteristic help the reader do? Okay, it helps the reader paint a picture of what his dog blank. So fill in the blanks as best you can. Pause the video to make sure you have enough time to fill in your purple workbook. Now it's time to synthesize or put together all this information. Explain what Jack has learned about poetry at this point in the novel, based on what he says and writes. You can use the sentence frame that I've given you. Jack has learned a lot about poetry. Some of the things he has learned are that poems can blank or blank or blank. And so what you'd want to do is go back to your other notes, think about what we just talked about now, think about what he has learned about poetry overall, and you can fill in those blanks. Use the sentence starter to help you. Pause the video to make sure you have enough time to fill in your purple workbook. When you're reading poetry, it's very important to pay attention to the punctuation marks. That is, the periods, commas, colons, semicolons, anything that you see you need to pause at. You don't pause at the end of every line, you pause at the punctuation marks. So for example, in the poem The Red Wheelbarrow, you'll see that there's only a period at the very end of the poem. That is to be read like a whole sentence. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow, glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. It should not be read, so much depends upon a red wheel barrow, glazed with rain, water, beside the white chickens. My second reading of The Red Wheelbarrow sounded very choppy, and it is not how the author intended it to sound. Take a look at the poem Dog by Valerie Worth. In this poem there is lots of punctuation. There are commas, there are semicolons, and periods, all things that you need to pay attention to while you are reading this poem. Listen carefully. Under a maple tree the dog lies down, lolls his limp tongue, yawns, rests his long chin carefully between front paws, looks up alert, chops with heavy jaws at a slow fly, blinks, rolls on his side, sighs, closes his eyes, sleeps all afternoon in his loose skin. Now listen to the poem if I were to stop at the end of each line. Under a maple tree. The dog lies down, lolls his limp tongue, yawns, rests his long chin, carefully between front paws, looks up alert, chops with heavy, jaws at slow fly, blinks, rolls, on his side, sighs, closes his eyes, sleeps, all afternoon, in his loose skin. See how different that poem sounds when you read it line by line instead of paying attention to the punctuation marks? So this is something very important to note when you're practicing your poems that you're going to read out loud. Let's review. What makes a poem a poem? In Lesson 2, you learned that poems have structure, which includes lines and stanzas. Stanzas, remember, are a group of lines, kind of like a paragraph. Poems can be free verse, like The Red Wheelbarrow. And poems use lots of imagery, words or phrases that help an author imagine what is happening in the poem or visualize what's happening in the poem. In Lesson 3, we read the poem Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, and in that poem we noticed that there was a lot of rhyming words. There was some repetition in the last two lines. The poem had a regular rhythm to it, and also it was a narrative poem. It was a poem that told a story. Told the story of a man who wants to stay in the woods but cannot because he has many miles to go. After reading our novel today and the poem Dog by Valerie Worth, we've noticed some more characteristics of poetry that we can add to our chart. First of all, the structure of Dog had no stanzas but lots of lines. There was also a lot of punctuation that helped the reader know when to pause. So that can be a big part of poetry. this poem was also a free verse poem. It had no rhyme or regular rhythm to it. And the author uses a lot of imagery or words that create pictures in the mind when she wrote things like lols, limp tongue, long chin, yawns, chops, sighs. All of those words create a picture in the reader's mind. All right, now at this point, there are some questions I want you to ask yourself. And you can pause the video at any time to give yourself some time to think about responses to these questions. You don't need to record them anywhere, just have those thoughts in your mind. What are your thoughts or feelings about poetry now? Have they changed after reading the book and the poem? Are your thoughts and feelings similar or different from Jack's? So again, go ahead and pause the video to think about the answers to these questions. Your next steps, your homework. Reread pages 12 through 19 of Love That Dog and the poem Dog aloud to someone at home or in front of the mirror to practice your fluency. Pick out one vivid word or phrase from Dog to add to the vivid words and phrases section of your poetry journal. And finally, complete poetry task number 2 in the My Poem section of your poetry journal. You can also prepare for the mid-unit assessment by reading ahead in the novel Love That Dog. End of Lesson 4.